Welcome to episode 12 of The Reading Cure. In this episode, we'll be discussing the novella The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. Welcome to The Reading Cure, where great books and great ideas are what we like to prescribe. My name is Dr. Stephen Davis, and my co-host is Dr. Alexander Fox. Now, the author of this week's featured novella, Robert Louis Stevenson, was a truly remarkable individual who, in his 44 years of life, which were plagued by severe bronchial troubles and extensive spells of being bedridden, nevertheless managed to travel the world, befriend a great many artistic contemporaries, notably Henry James, and produce a vast amount of his own highly regarded writings, which made him something of an international celebrity. Stevenson was born into a prominent Edinburgh family whose profession was lighthouse design and construction, but rather than settle into the family business, the adventurous freethinker Robert opted instead to pursue a life of letters. He travelled extensively in the USA, Caribbean and South Pacific during the latter decades of the 19th century when he was alive, and he eventually settled in Samoa, where he spent his final 4 years of life with his family, becoming a prominent and beloved political figure on the islands, which were undergoing the incursion of Western colonial power at that time. Stevenson was a prolific essayist and travel writer, but he is perhaps best known for his iconic novels such as Treasure Island, Kidnapped, and today's featured work, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So turning to this novella, this Gothic mystery was first published in 1886 and follows investigations made by a London lawyer named Gabriel Utterson into his friend and client Henry Jekyll, an eminent scientist. Having recently been perplexed by his friend's decision to alter his will in order to leave his fortune to a hitherto unknown individual named Edward Hyde, Utterson learns that Hyde is actually a violent and reprehensible man, and he infers from Jekyll's evasiveness in explaining their relationship that blackmail of some kind is at its root. The truth, of course, is no mystery to modern audiences. Jekyll and Hyde are in fact the same person. Jekyll has engineered a serum in his chemistry lab that allows him to transform himself into Hyde and back again at will, effectively splitting off his unwelcome desires and behaviours into the form of Hyde, so that as Jekyll he can both focus uninterruptedly on his beloved scientific researches, as well as enjoying maximal public acclaim without any risk of being tempted into vice, and thus risking his precious reputation. Jekyll has gone as far as to set up lodgings for his alter ego in the then notorious district of Soho, from which Hyde has been engaging in various unspecified acts of debauchery. This convenient and highly dangerous arrangement soon unravels in a twofold manner. Firstly, when in a fit of rage, Hyde murders a prominent politician named Sir Danvers Carew in the street one night, thus becoming known to and pursued by the authorities. And secondly, when Jekyll loses control over the ability to transform back and forth into Hyde, with his evil double coming to increasingly remain present. The mystery is only revealed at the end of the story by way of a letter that Jekyll has sent to Utterson shortly before his death, which came in the form of Hyde committing suicide to evade capture. Now, just a short apology in advance of the main discussion section for this episode, which is that due to some technology issues that were beyond our control at the time, we're having to use a backup version of a recording for this one. It does contain some audible glitches at a few points, so apologies in advance for that. We do hope that you'll still be able to enjoy the conversation. So, first question on Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde then, Alec. So obviously it would be an understatement to describe this as an iconic story, given the degree of its cultural importance. Why do you think the Jekyll and Hyde scenario has proved to be such a compelling one?
Well, probably on a really basic level, the battle of good against evil is one of those perennial themes. And Jekyll and Hyde as an allegory captures it very succinctly in a very kind of direct, almost pure form. So I could see that that would be one of the reasons why it's become so famous, so iconic, so much referred to in everyday life, because good against evil, you could argue that in various forms, that is the theme of literature.
Sure.
So it has that ubiquitous quality. I think on a deeper level, if we're going to agree, at least for the moment, with Freud and his position in civilization and its discontents, Freud advocated the view that we had to pay a price for civilization. We had to pay a price for being civilized and moral. And the price that we had to pay is that many of our desires had to go frustrated, that we would have to suppress them, that we would actually carry a degree of ambivalence throughout our lives as a civilized creature. And so this conflict between what society and what morality expects of us, and also what we might want to do, what we might be tempted to do, he saw that as the conflict of the civilized person. And we see that in Jekyll and Hyde too, don't we? That conflict. So if we were seeing it in a Freudian way, it is exemplifying the inner conflict that arises from being a civilized person. And, if Freud has a point, even up to a point, it's something that every civilized person could relate to. The conflict between what we're expected to do, what we should do, to put it one way, and what we would like to do.
Absolutely, yeah. It's interesting, actually. I mean, I in a few points earlier when I was thinking about our questions for tonight, Freudian ideas came to mind. I think it's hard not to really think about Freud when you reflect on this scenario. And I think that I think Jekyll and Hyde came out maybe a few years, not that long before Freudian ideas particularly became more widespread. But I think it is, like, in some sense, both are maybe reflecting on the kind of society, the particularly kind of Victorian era social world. And it does, as you say. I mean, I think this is the dilemma, I suppose, when society has very exacting public behaviours and morals and so on that are expected, then people are going to feel that they're in a state of repressing aspects of themselves,
yes.
I would have thought.
Yeah.
So I think that is definitely something. I think that we'll probably be able to come back to these as we kind of deconstruct the book. Yes.
Well, yes, yeah. I mean, the thing is that neither of us are obviously experts in the Victorian era, but how the Victorian era is often understood is that, public respectability was deified. There was a sanctity to your home life and a sanctity to your public life. Yes. And because the standards that you were meant to adhere to in your public life were quite stringent, you could see why that tension between the public and the private, between the persona and one's private self, could be particularly stark for the Victorians. And so you can see why it would particularly have captured their imagination as a horror story, in a sense, because what Stevenson was depicting was a sort of nightmarish scenario where you gave in to temptation and then you were ruined. I mean, obviously there's the supernatural elements mixed in with the scientific elements in the story. It's science fiction to some extent. But, if we see it as an allegory, we see it as an allegory for what could happen if a Victorian gentleman was to give in to temptation. So it must have captured their imaginations and horrified them in some way. I mean, while it's well written and there's a certain temperance to its style, it has almost a tabloid quality, this idea of the very imminent Dr. Jekyll then becoming the most downgoing, to use that Victorian phrase, of men.
Yes, that's an interesting point. You're quite right. It does. Yeah, I mean, the style of the writing has that kind of formality, obviously through Utterson, in terms of the voice. But yeah, it is quite sensationalist in terms of the actual the way the plot unfolds. So,
well, yes,
so yeah, I think it would. It's interesting. I think that's a really good point. That the way you're describing this would capture, particularly, the kind of Victorian audience. To me, it did seem like it was almost like a kind of meditation by Stevenson on this problem, actually, of this split that maybe people who lived then particularly felt between the public and the private. But it's interesting, obviously, the Jekyll and Hyde premise, has endured, far beyond that society. People have continued to find it. I think that's an interesting one to consider as well.
Well, I mean, I think that's for a couple of reasons. Obviously, one of them that we've intimated, that if Freud has a point, then as long as you have society, you're going to have this conflict to some degree. It may vary according to the society that we're in, but even if our society is seen as being much more liberal than the Victorian, there still is this discrepancy between the persona and the private life. And there's still this keen interest in scandal. Because, I mean, obviously what happens to Jekyll is a scandal of the time. And scandals still obviously intrigue us because, if we see fiction as a way of elaborating the consequences of certain actions, if we see fiction as highlighting how, if we embrace parts of ourselves, what direction that we might head in towards, then, we're going to be drawn in by the story of Jekyll and Hyde, even though we're in a different era.
Yes, absolutely. I think you're right. I mean, I think there's actually a number of ingredients that the story has that do give it a kind of timeless appeal, actually. I think you're quite right about that. I mean, I suppose there's also the issue that a lot of drama relies upon the idea of characters who are not what they appear to be. This idea that there's either due to some duplicity or because they have a dark side, that there's something about their surface presentation that isn't quite what they really are. And, it struck me, I suppose, that we're kind of hardwired to monitor and evaluate people around us just in general for the degree to which they're sincere or duplicitous, because obviously in our kind of evolutionary past, your survival could depend on that fact. We're wired to be interested in whether the presented self and the real or deeper self actually match in a given person. So I suppose that you could say that this story is almost like a kind of archetypal sort of drama of that. That's taken to such an extreme where there's this split, the good character is actually physically transforming into his absolute opposite, and of course nobody realizes this is happening for a period of time, so that, it really is quite a potent kind of dramatic concept, that really, I guess.
Well, it is, and I think that's a good point, that we are wired to, work out what each person's level of trustworthiness is, from a biological evolutionary perspective. We have to ferret out in some way, people's real character, because, we know it's something that we learn painfully from experience, that how people present themselves and who they are nearly never the same. They're nearly never synonymous. So we have to, work that out. Of course, one of the ironic things is that sometimes people present themselves as worse than what they are, because, this is to do with self-knowledge too. People can overlook their strengths as well. So self-presentations and how someone actually is don't coincide. I think, though, that what makes this particularly a horror story, though, is that the evil is not located outside. This is not like someone needing to work out who Iago is. Iago famously said, I am not what I am. That duplicity was such an essential part of his character, but the evil was external in that sense. You know, if you were looking out to find out who's an Iago, then you're kind of imagining that the evil is outside. But here, in Jekyll and Hyde, the evil is actually in everyone. It's internal. And that is something that would be unnerving to the readers of the time. It's unnerving also for us as well, because it forces us to look at our own character, our own nature, and that we can't simply imagine that we are good and that others could be, the evil lies outside us, it's external to us.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's interesting, actually. I don't know if you'll agree with this, but it struck me thinking again about this story that there's a sort of echo of the Ring of Gyges myth, and that Plato kind of had this kind of famous thought experiment on, the idea. Obviously, in that instance, somebody becomes invisible, completely unconstrained by any social considerations, and then what would they do? And obviously here it's it's not invisibility, it's this this kind of magical, seemingly magical scientific power that Jekyll has developed to be able to kind of live out these unrestrained vices that he's tempted to do. But again, it is, as you say, I think what's key here is it's troubling because it raises, it's not just about Jekyll, it's about what's in everybody, the idea that the shadowy sides and the sides that are being repressed, I guess, so it does kind of extend widely in that sort of unnerving way.
It does. I mean, I think that's an interesting point about the Ring of Gyges, because the way I interpreted it is that Jekyll, with great naivety, thought that the potion was like the ring, and that if he turned into Hyde, he could then embrace these pleasures, these desires unfettered, and then he could drink the potion again and disappear. I think at one point in the novel, I think it's in his statement of the case, Jekyll says that Hyde could be like a breath stain on a mirror. He could just disappear as though he'd never been there before. Now, I mean, that is showing great naivety, because as the novel underscores, Hyde carries out a variety of criminal actions, murderous actions, and so that this idea that there would be no real comeback necessarily is maybe a bit naive as well.
Indeed, yeah. But I think it is a similar scenario in that sense, though, isn't it? Really,
I think it is. I mean, if we imagine a scenario where Jekyll was able to take the potion, become Hyde, take the potion again, become Jekyll, and had control over when he became Hyde, then I think we could have had a Ring of Gyges situation up to a point. Although Enfield's story regarding the child shows that Hyde could have been caught, and so it wasn't quite the same as invisibility, actually.
No.
But the thing that really takes it away from the Ring of Gyges story narrative is that Hyde ends up gaining this control over Jekyll's psyche. He turns into Hyde without taking the potion, and then it becomes increasingly difficult to get his hands on the ingredients to return back to Jekyll. Sure. And of course, this is an allegory for addiction, how addiction can take you over, consume you.
It's a good point, isn't it? Because he says in his letter, as explaining his actions, that initially, Hyde is much smaller than Jekyll, and he says he was only, 9/10 of him was the good part, and only 1/10 was the evil part. And of course, as time goes on, this grows in strength and strength. So yeah, I think you're right. I think the sort of addiction idea, addicted to, I guess, vice here in general, and the kick he's getting from being Hyde. Comes out with his control, actually.
Well, it does. I mean, to elaborate a bit on your idea of the Ring of Gyges, I think one of the interesting parallels between the Gyges story and the Jekyll and Hyde story is that both of them are concerned about morality in as far as it's looking good.
Yes,
exactly. And so the cloak of invisibility well, you can do what you want because you don't need to concern yourself with looking good. Plato had written the story because it was to illustrate the point of, how much are we actually good and how much are we concerned with looking good. And I think that quite a good proportion of Jekyll's moral psyche was focused on looking good. Now, we could, criticize him as an individual, but it's clear that there's no doubt a societal critique there, that in Victorian society where there's so much emphasis on how you come across, respectability, your status in society, that looking good ends up having so much of a preeminence that it might actually be damaging ultimately to your moral character.
Yeah, I think that's an absolutely fundamental point. I think actually that's maybe one we'll maybe come back to a little later, because I think you're spot on. Jekyll's own interpretation of good and evil here is actually very suspect in this story, and that's certainly something we're going to talk about.
Suspect and yet common at the time. Anyway.
Well, indeed. The second question we're going to discuss, which ties in nicely with this, is about the character, the narrator, effectively, or mainly Utterson, the lawyer. And he is described, differently from Jekyll. He's a very formal, taciturn, emotionally unexpressive character. But at the same time, he's described as being one that others like and trust and want to socialise with, actually, despite his reserve. And he's also described as being very drawn to those who are downfallen. Now, probably, Stevenson's chosen this character in order to draw a kind of contrast here that we'll maybe can come back to in terms of morality and so on. But how, in terms of Utterson himself, this kind of central character, how would you kind of assess his psychology? How would you kind of see him?
Well, I think maybe a good way of looking at the psychology is, first of all, to consider his function in the novel. It's difficult for us to conceive of Jekyll and Hyde as a mystery story now, because, most people that haven't read the actual novel know that they are one and the same.
Yes. Whereas
obviously a Victorian reader, unless they'd heard from someone that had, read the book before and then spoil it for them, would assume that they were two separate people. And so it's a mystery story in many ways. And so I think that Utterson being a lawyer is quite important to this being a mystery story, because he becomes a sort of detective, doesn't he? And being a lawyer, people can confess to him. He's someone that they could take into their confidence. And, much of the story is written in terms of these private documents that are written for Utterson and Utterson alone to read. And being a lawyer, he's in this sort of privileged position. He deals with matters of law and order and of criminality, and these friends and clients can confess to him through their various letters. So I think that's one of the reasons why he chose a lawyer as the narrator. But a kind of deeper reason is that, if we look at Utterson himself, Stevenson writes that he was, the last person to exert a good influence on downgoing men. And so, Utterson as this lawyer occupies this liminal space between law and order and criminality, and he sort of tries to stop people that are crossing this permeable border between the two, downgoing men that are about to fall into disrepute. And he is this loyal and almost obsessed friend that tries to prevent that. Now, that then raises issues about his psychology, because we could ask, well, to what extent is his motivations altruistic, a sign of being a philanthropist in spirit, and how much is it to do with that because he's helping these men that are falling into disrepute, that he can actually from the sidelines, indulge, vicariously in their sins.
Yeah, I think that was an excellent assessment there, actually, of Utterson's function in the novel, Alec. And I think that's what actually makes this such a great character and a well-crafted story in that sense, is that he, exactly as you described, he has that extremely useful function that ties it together. But I think it is more than that, actually. I think you're right. I mean, to me, psychologically, it seemed like he is the kind of repressed Victorian character, maybe in a way that Jekyll, who's more overtly battling with these kind of vices that he's really drawn to indulge in, but he fears will discredit his public image. Utterson isn't really having that kind of battle with himself. Actually, he's not needing to live any kind of double life. I mean, there's a little it describes him at the start. It says that when the wine was to his taste, something eminently human beaconed from his eye, something indeed which never found its way into his talk, but which spoke only in these silent symbols of the after-dinner face, but more often and loudly in the acts of his life. And it's this idea that he's somebody who is quite it describes his home life as very kind of barren. I thought that it's interesting that somebody as kind of repressed and reserved as that is so drawn to the downfall, and because there is this perhaps sense of kind of almost a vicarious or a kind of morbid fascination in a way with those that have given into vice, and so he maybe almost has a kind of sympathy for them because he's aware on some level there's a temptation there, but he's not bold enough to actually, bold maybe isn't the word, but he's detached himself emotionally. He hasn't really quite taken on board, the conflicts in the way that others have.
Yes, Well, I mean, we know that the novel in the main would not characterize his restraint as a lack of boldness, because Jekyll's boldness, so to speak, ends so badly. Yes. But for us reading it, we can think that that whether Stevenson intended it or not, there is a kind of critique of Victorian morality in the character of Utterson. I mean, the biographer Hugh Kingsmill, when he said that that the intention behind Victorian morality was to suppress the heroic, as he put it. Okay. And what he meant by that is that, this is a morality that fetishizes restraint, holding back. More, we see that in the character of Utterson, that he, one of the lines is that he drank gin in private to mortify his taste for vintages. So it's like if you've got any kind of abiding desire, the main thing is to restrain it, even if it is like occasional indulgences. And we kind of see that in Jekyll's actions too, because before Hyde came on the scene, so to speak, Jekyll was doing a version of that himself, even though I think it's intimated that his indulgences were more of a sexual nature.
Yes.
But we can see in Utterson this paragon of restraint, someone that follows rules of conduct religiously. I mean, we see that when him and Enfield are talking about the Hyde, episode with the child, and Enfield explains why he didn't probe too much. He says, the more it seems like Queer Street, the less I ask questions, and Utterson approves of this and thinks it's a good rule to live by, because that's how Utterson does things. However, I mean, there are complexities there in this story, because Stevenson, for one, shows that even in the case of Utterson, there's intimations of repressed desires. There's intimations of part of him he's not entirely law abiding. There's that little episode where he is accompanied by a police officer and in a carriage, and when he looks at the policeman, he sort of feels this pang of guilt that the narrator says everyone feels. So I think there's the point that even if Utterson feels it, then it is universal. I mean, he is obviously quite, in some ways he's very loyal. He goes out of his way to try and work out to what extent his friend Jekyll is in trouble. But there is also a sort of small-minded, narrow perspective that he has. I was particularly struck by that bit when he enters Jekyll's house with Poole the butler to find out what's actually going on in that room. Is Jekyll alive? Is Hyde there? And he sees the servants standing at the fireside, and the narrator says that he was peevishly annoyed at this, and he says how unseemly. He doesn't really have much sympathy for the servants who are worried for their master there. But I think, sorry.
So I know. I think you're right. I mean, I think it seems like there's to some degree, there's a subtle critique, if not almost parody, subtly of Utterson by Stevenson in this. Because there's no doubt his bachelor lifestyle, as it's described, is so conformist and restrained that it just seems very lifeless and barren. And I did wonder whether, in a way, this has almost been posited as an alternative to an alternative pseudo solution to the dilemma that Jekyll describes. This problem, you have to be a respectable gentleman to get on, and in his case, he's taken this radical move of this serum so he can split off his dark side. And then in Utterson, you have complete repression. An alternative strategy in a way, or maybe just an alternative kind of personality in terms of how he would respond to that. Very morally or very repressive society. But it's interesting.
I mean, I think that's a good point. I mean, if we see Utterson as a representative of the good life, then it is rather narrow and barren indeed in some ways. And you could actually argue that to some extent his interest in helping other people, particularly downgoing men, is to lend a sense of spice to a rather bland life in many ways. The fact that he's living his life through other people's stories, it's a little bit like the reader that is living this life of little incident and interest that loses themselves in dramatic tales, novels, a bit like maybe some of the readership actually of the original, the original readership of the novel there. So yes, it isn't really a great strong contrast. I mean, I was thinking that myself, that there is no robust sense of the good.
No.
Here, there's no character, there's no Atticus Finch, another lawyer. In this sort of novel. You've got in contrast to Jekyll, Utterson isn't necessarily that morally edifying or encouraging. As you say, there is a certain barrenness there. Whether that's what Stevenson quite intended, I'm not really quite sure, but it's how it comes across, at least to us reading the novel. I think another aspect of the psychology here that would be really important to highlight is that this novel, as you might have gathered, has been interpreted by some people in a queer theory kind of way, in terms of repressed homosexual desire. And I'm not necessarily saying this is the only way to read this novel, but I think, when I read about this and then read the actual novel, that one thing that was intriguing is that the possible blackmail of Jekyll almost brings forth these nightmarish visions for Utterson. And I thought it was quite telling that when he's lying in his bed, struggling to get to sleep, and he's being visited by these nightmarish visions, that he has this vision of, Jekyll lying in his bed and Hyde coming to his bed, tearing open the curtains of the bed and getting Jekyll then to do his bidding, as it's put.
Yes.
That it's quite a telling kind of dream to have, at least for us that are more influenced by Freud there.
I think you're right. And it's interesting that obviously the time this was being written, you can see in the as you suggested, this sort of faint allusion to the idea that, Utterson has concerns that Jekyll and Hyde, thinking they're separate people, there's a sexual relationship there, and this is
blackmail.
But it's like that's such a scandal in that world. It's not even put into print what he fears the scandal might be. Exactly, no. It can't even be stated. So there is a kind of sense of that level of fear and repression around sexuality, without doubt.
Well, yes, I mean, it's the unspeakable at that time. It could be alluded to, but it can't even be directly stated. It's so awful a proposition. But I think the thing is that, what's ambiguous about Utterson's response when he's having this nightmarish vision of Jekyll being disturbed in his bed by Hyde is that it's ambiguous because it is both horrifying and compelling for Utterson. So we've got this case of, a classic case of, repressed desire, really, that there is both the fear and the attraction welded together.
Yeah,
there.
It's very Freudian again, isn't it? Really,
I think it is. And this idea of Hyde being the younger man, obviously his youth can be interpreted symbolically in a number of ways. But, this younger man that could possibly be blackmailing him.
Yep.
And, Jekyll leaving all his money to him. I mean, that could suggest both blackmail and a degree of intimacy.
Yes.
That in that society would have been seen as scandalous at the time, unfortunately.
Yeah, well, indeed, and when Utterson obviously, brings this up with Jekyll, his concerns about this, he doesn't push it too far, I guess, because he, in some sense, maybe doesn't want to hear, or when Jekyll says, just leave this, Utterson, don't push me on why I want to do this. He leaves it at that because he kind of has to, in a way, I suppose. It's if this friendship is to maintain, it's like they can't go into that territory. Although that's not what it actually is, of course. But as far as Utterson would see it, that's maybe at root of it.
Yes, and I mean the thing is that there would also be an understanding that if it was a sexual relationship, it could not be, discussed openly.
No.
It could only but be alluded to. This is, I think, a part of the novel. So I do think some of the queer readings have a certain cogency, here in terms of what is seen as threatening. Why desire is seen as threatening. Obviously, it's threatening because, it is not socially approved of at the time, but it is also something that the characters may feel because women are not generally present in this novel. I mean, there is the maid that sees the murder of Sir Danvers Carew and some of the servants, but they're not that important in the novel. It's quite a homosocial world of bachelors. I mean, that's also structurally needed as well because, if Jekyll was married, it would be rather difficult for him to leave as Hyde and live that life. So he needs to be a bachelor. But I think also that bachelor homosocial world that they're in, there is the possible subtext of homosexual desire.
Yeah, and it's interesting that as well because it struck me just reading a little bit about when the novel was written. Obviously, famously, Stoker's Dracula, this idea, the dream that he had, where Dracula says, this man belongs to me, and the kind of, homosexual undertones to that, which Stoker himself may not have been entirely conscious of. Actually, this novel, Jekyll and Hyde, apparently was written when Stevenson was extremely ill in a kind of frenzy over a number of days, which, again, there's a sort of almost Freudian free association quality to that, and that there could be a lot of unconscious ideas, in a way, being expressed and explored here that Stevenson himself may or may not have been completely aware of. And I think,
that is possible. I was reading a little bit about this from that queer theory perspective, and apparently Stevenson, lived quite a bohemian lifestyle for the time, and that he had some gay associates, or some men that maybe were gay but hadn't quite, avowed it to themselves at the time. And it does seem as though some of these associates had fallen in love with him. It did intimate that he wasn't, it wasn't clear, how Stevenson himself was, was he bisexual?
Okay. Sure.
Was he straight? It's not clear. But certainly he moved in bohemian circles, and so that aspect of life would be particularly obvious to him. Clearly, he didn't have the typical Victorian attitude to that. We do know that he frequented female prostitutes.
Okay.
But as you say, maybe part of his subconscious, maybe there was a homosexual desire there on some level that came out through the story.
I wonder, but certainly it sounds like, a different character from Bram Stoker, and obviously more
well, I think
self-aware exploration there.
Yeah, quite a few people have written in the case of Stoker that he had, a very admirous attachment to his. He managed Henry Irving, who was sort of the Laurence Olivier of the time.
Okay.
And, it's intimated that Stoker might have had what we could call, in a straightforward way, a crush on Henry Irving. And some people have argued that Dracula is sort of a stand-in for Henry Irving. Whether that's the case or not, it does seem like there is a queer theory reading of Dracula, this idea of the other. At the time, anyway, what would be defined as the other, and the perceived threat of that at the time. And this seems to be part of the Jekyll and Hyde story, that Utterson is frightened that Jekyll is in some gay relationship and is getting blackmailed. But it doesn't just frighten him; he's also obsessed by it, compelled by the nightmarish vision of it, suggests that there could be some attraction there as well.
Yeah, I think that's it. Well, coming on to another, again, Freudian theme here in this next question, really just looking at a slightly different angle. And so Hyde is described in the novella as he's often described as giving the impression of deformity without actually being deformed, and inspiring murderous hate in all who see him. And so the next question to explore was the issue of whether we think, is this simply because Hyde has an extremely evil presence and it's a straightforward one, or was Stevenson maybe suggesting that this reaction is more about the average person in terms of what they are battling within themselves, the idea of what it is about themselves that being in Hyde's presence evokes that produces this wish to murder. But it's very clear he repeatedly, when describing these scenes involving Hyde, there's the very respectable doctor, for example, who comes out to help the child that Hyde has injured.
so on. All these people who see him, it says they want to kill him on sight. It's not just they find him repulsive, they want to murder him. So I thought, that's an interesting point, isn't it? That again, I thought a kind of Freudian reading there could be the idea of this, extreme disgust being a kind of reaction formation, that comes over a repressed wish. The idea that maybe when they see Hyde, they are both repelled, but also allured by something in themselves that they're battling against. I don't know.
Yeah,
do you think that's that kind of Freudian take works there? Is there something of that?
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, if we look at the novel, the idea that once we complete the novel, we'd be aware that the author would wish to convey that everyone has a Hyde side to themselves. So I'm sure that the way in which they react is, as they say in psychoanalysis, a reaction formation, a sort of repulsion because it evokes something in themselves. I'm sure that is part of the way in which they react. The vagueness of, the lack of tangibility about what this evil presence is, I think it's, Stephen's way of not locating it solely in Hyde, giving it this sort of more general layer. They can't put quite their finger on it because it isn't just in him, so to speak, but in themselves too. I think also something for us to keep in mind is that the Victorians were deeply affected, as you can imagine, by Darwin's theory of evolution. And what they were particularly worried about was that if man could evolve, there could also be devolution.
Yes.
And so they were worried about degeneracy. And they had this view, which, has long since been discredited for obvious reasons, that how someone looked would give you an idea of their moral character. Yeah. So, this sort of seeming deformity, but not too tangible, I think is also invoking this idea that Hyde was epitomizing a degree of degeneracy. Yeah, that he represented a sort of devolution because he's rather small and stunted as he's portrayed.
Yeah,
there, and the Victorians had this fear that devolution could be contagious. That degeneracy. And so it's almost like something that could contaminate, and that you wish to step back from and not get too close to.
I think that's actually a very good point, because it seems such a silly notion to us now. But I mean, I remember from some of my sociology reading in the past, there was the criminologist Lombroso, who I think actually went to prisons and looked at the shape of skulls of various prisoners, and there was a serious theory about alternative evolutionary branches of humans who were degenerate, as you described. So I suppose that is a point we should keep in mind here as to what part of the might have been suggested about Hyde in this horror that he inspired.
Well, I mean, if you look at how Hyde's actions were described when he attacked Sir Danvers Carew, the phrase is with an ape-like spite.
Yeah.
So it is this reference to the ape in oneself.
Yep.
Actually, in the marvelous Frederick March film version, he is portrayed almost as a Neanderthal, there to highlight that this is connected with our animal past. Yes. This is something that we could talk a bit more about when we look at the nature of good and evil in this novel. Yes. How the animal side of us is actually portrayed. But yes, for the Victorians, the animal side would have been the non-civilized side, the side that would be degenerate, and Hyde epitomizes that in some ways, with his small, seemingly stunted demeanor, but not to the extent that it is so palpable. Almost like it's the beginning of degeneracy. That is what's frightening, because you could see the beginning of the illness, so to speak, and this is what frightens them. To return to your point about they're wanting to murder him, attack him.
Yeah.
I mean, it is quite an interesting reaction that's a response to the evil in Hyde, that they then want to attack him. It's not necessarily the most civilized response. It's because he touches on something so visceral, so primal in them. And I think from a psychoanalytic point of view, this idea of destroying something that embodies part of yourself that you hate, or you struggle with. I mean, it might seem a little bit odd to bring in John Wayne Gacy at this point, but I think John Wayne Gacy is an excellent illustration of this, because if anyone's watched the Netflix documentary about him or read about him, John Wayne Gacy was brought up in this environment with his dad, ridiculing him for his seeming effeminacy, and Gacy was bisexual, and I think part of him hated what he saw as that more effeminate side of himself. And so, his way of dealing with that was to have sex with young men and then murder them. Almost like he was trying to kill off that part that unfortunately he came to despise because of his upbringing. And so, that's a real life example of this compulsion to try and, destroy part of oneself that you're struggling with, and their desire to murder or at least attack Hyde is similar in that regard. I'm not saying that the parts are morally the same, of course, but
no. I think you're right about that parallel, though. It's clearly suggested here that all the good citizens we meet have this potential for violence buried within them, and it is triggered by when they see Hyde, and obviously one of the things part of that is recognising the unpleasant sides of him, but it's also recognising that they keep talking about his being very fleet of foot or light on his feet and very energetic and spontaneous, and so it's things that we wouldn't now consider to necessarily all be evil. No. These could actually be healthy traits to some extent, but what the commonality is, they're the repressed parts that, as you suggested, could be seen as more animal-like, ape-like. And it's definitely seems like he has, they're given this vision of somebody that symbolises all that they want to both control in themselves, but on another level actually unleash. And so that it's like they want to kill their shadow side in him. It's that kind of dramatic way to somehow remove this inner division. There's that.
Well, it is.
He's inspiring that. So
yes, it is, and I'm just thinking about another example. As you would expect, I'm going to refer to Harold Pinter again, but one of his shorter plays, One for the Road, is about this political torturer torturing a dissident, and we don't really hear much from the victim, but the torturer has this idea that the victim has all these kinds of doubts and uncertainties. And really what it is that, the torturer is a political fanatic, but deep down there's all these uncertainties and doubts, which he then is transferred onto this dissident. And that's why he's wanting to torture and kill the man, because he wants to strangle his own doubts.
Absolutely,
So it's something similar there. I think it's part of human nature, unfortunately, to try and detach certain unwanted traits, project it onto other people, and then harm them in some way as an attempt to, create a sort of inner peace of sorts, even though that doesn't really, obviously work there. I think another aspect of it, which is not saying something great about ourselves, but is the case, is that you often find that people are tempted to prove their goodness by attacking people that are bad.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
There. So, don't get me wrong. I could understand why people could be really angry and hurt at say what a Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper, did. Yeah. But if you watch the footage of, the police van arriving at the courthouse or at the police station when he was first apprehended. Yeah, these people are baying for blood.
Yeah.
And I don't think that I think they would have ripped him limb from limb.
Yeah.
And they would have done that, I think, because obviously the horror of what he committed, but also I think in a way it's a sign of them thinking they're proving their righteousness, their goodness. And even though I don't think that's the best expression of it.
No, that's true. I think you're right. I mean, we see in the scene in that novel where Hyde has been apprehended after his assault on the child, where he tramples over her, the degree to which the good citizens that get involved are willing to, go to ruin him, to get, there's a kind of, obviously deserves retribution, but there's like almost a vindictiveness in this, and how far they're willing to go to squeeze as much money out of him. And, there is, as you say, it's not just a straightforwardly good, kind, empathetic reaction for the victim there. It's going further than that. There does seem to actually be, repressed hostility coming out in this,
yes,
almost a need to demonstrate goodness by, and bond by,
well, I think
the bad.
I mean that episode with Enfield and Hyde and so on.
Yeah.
It's quite amusing in a way. I mean, I thought to myself when I was reading the novel that they spent time together until the bank opened in the morning.
Yes,
and
right.
And the idea that you're spending time with this person that left you with a sense of evil incarnate that had stomped over a child. I mean, what kind of conversations did they have until the bank opened? It had almost a camp feel to it, that, this idea of them hanging around together until the bank opened. It had a degree of implausibility to it.
Yes,
I think another implausibility to it is that, if you saw such an act happening in front of your eyes and you were able to apprehend the man, this idea that you extricate money from him rather than hand him over to the police is a bit odd.
Yes.
Really there. They threatened him with harming his good name, even though obviously he didn't have a good name, but they threatened him with that, and Hyde is not immune to that threat because he's obviously thinking about how it could impact on Jekyll and therefore himself too. But it did seem quite an odd way of punishing him for what he did. There, to be honest.
It's interesting. It highlighted, well, on the one hand, the extent to which the loss of a good name would be seen as such a terrible prospect back then, far more so than the loss of the money. But also the fact that they wanted to, they took the chance in a sense to try and squeeze him, for as much as they could get, rather than simply just hand him over to the police and move on. They wanted to stay and be involved in this, and there was a kind of enjoyment, presumably. Obviously it's an implausible scenario, as you suggested, this all-night vigil till the bank opens. But assuming taking it as it does seem, what were they hanging around for there, really?
I mean, to be honest, I don't think I would have felt comfortable having a nap in Hyde's presence. Did people have to take turns following Hyde to the bathroom in case he did a runner?
It does evoke a lot of questions. That
it is quite an amusing one. But I think getting more serious about it here is that the right thing to have done would have been to hand him over to the police, given what he had done. But here we can kind of see that there is a certain aptness to them threatening him with ruining his good name, because, as you say, it emphasizes the importance of your good name, of respectability. But I think it also, in a less direct way, emphasizes that they are getting a certain sadistic pleasure.
Yes,
from punishing him in that way. So actually, sadism of a sort is entering into this.
Well, they wanted to kill him, as it's they wouldn't, because again they're good names and so on, and they're restrained. So they try to almost symbolically do that. They want to extract from him, in this way, in the form of almost like a slow torture punishment for him. Which again, obviously he deserves a punishment because he's done something horrible. But again, it's the personal investment in it by them, rather than, as you say, simply handing him over to the authorities.
Well,
that has the sadistic
yeah,
vibe to
yeah.
it, really, I think.
I do also have to remind you, though, that, if people have listened to our recording of Free Will, that the idea that Hyde deserves punishment, given what we argued in that recording.
Good point. We're not being consistent there, actually. No, you're quite right,
so I think we maybe won't bring in that side of the whole debate there about deserving.
It's not a strong argument, Nat. You're quite right. Yeah.
But yes, if we were looking at what was the right thing to do, what was going to protect people more, I think it might have been more handing him over to the police. But obviously, if he was handed over to the police and he spent time in jail, it wouldn't have been such a riveting tale, wouldn't it?
Well, no, there is that basic point as well. So maybe then moving on, to another aspect of this, which again highlights these kind of undercurrents to it. Jekyll, in the letter to Utterson after Hyde has been found having committed suicide, he explains his rationale in developing the serum as being an attempt to solve what he sees as the irreconcilability of his good and evil urges, and so it's essentially, he describes it as a means for him to become a more kind of perfect and unimpeachable citizen in the role of Jekyll by splitting off the Hyde part of himself. Now, from a sort of good mental health point of view, obviously we know this isn't literally a thing that anybody can possibly do in that sense, but if we were to sort of imagine a character battling with that kind of sense of inner division, what, from a good mental health point of view, would have been a better way for Jekyll to try to deal with those kind of feelings and thoughts, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, what we see with Jekyll is this striving after a kind of moral perfection, a desire for purity.
Yep.
And that's why he wants to separate and siphon off his so-called evil side. And that is his downfall, this unwillingness to accept that he will have less commendable sides to his nature. So I think that from a mental health perspective, I didn't think I would ever talk about acceptance and commitment therapy, otherwise known as ACT, in relation to Jekyll and Hyde, but here we go. But the acceptance and commitment therapy perspective is that we have these thoughts, feelings, and urges that we may not like, but our psyche is like a checkerboard, and so there will always be these aspects to our nature. We have to accept that there will be these dimensions. What is more important is what you act upon. That's the commitment part of it. So it's this recognition that, yes, you will have desires or impulses that aren't always moral. That's part of being human. But it doesn't mean to say that you can't commit to the values that are important to you. I mean, to be honest, you couldn't have a notion of commitment unless there was a degree of inner conflict, couldn't you? There'd be no point in making marriage vows in the interest of fidelity if lust was not, and cheating wasn't an option. So I think acceptance would be a key part of it. Acceptance of being, to put it in the most banal way, a mixed bag, that that we're all a mixed bag of good and bad, and obviously more neutral qualities too. But Jekyll can't accept that. That's probably in part to do with his ambitiousness there. I mean, it would be his so-called moral ambition, but I think it's also his ambition, as a scientist, that pushes him to try and separate out these parts. So I think acceptance would be a key part of it. Another key part is sort of something that Freud emphasized with his notion of the ego. When we're talking about ego here, we're not talking about ego in terms of the self-aggrandizing part of our natures, but the ego in the sense of the self, the conscious self. And Freud's aim was to, he says, wherever id was, there ego shall be. And what he meant was to make these urges, these desires conscious, because if they're conscious, then you can integrate them into your psyche. You could also be more aware of how they might impact on your actions, whereas suppressing these aspects of our nature, they may then work underground, so to speak, and come out in, you may act them out in a compulsive way, in an addictive way.
Yeah.
So consciousness, awareness of these aspects is so important from a mental health perspective too. Just one other point I would want to make is that I think it's important, and probably we don't need to be reminded of this as much as the Victorians, because we're more cynical and skeptical, I imagine, than the Victorians were. But we have to bear in mind that what society defines as good and evil isn't actually necessarily good and evil. Jung's idea of the shadow illustrates that, because, he said that the shadow might actually have some good qualities, but our society may not give us much opportunity to express them. We know, I think more so than the Victorians, that convention and morality don't necessarily coincide. So I think, like, from a mental health perspective, we have to be critiquing our norms and thinking about, is this actually bad? Obviously at one point, it would have been wrong for a woman to not get married, at one point in society. Yeah. That would have been bad. Yep. But obviously we can see that it is not inherently bad. It is more how that society ideologically defines it. So I think, again, in terms of our mental health, we have to consider good and evil ideologically as well as constructs.
Yeah. You're quite right, and in fact, I'll probably come back to this. There was a supplementary to the question, which was, and it isn't really actually separable from the point about mental health, which was this fact: is Jekyll's implicit definition of good and evil actually valid? And I think you've partly answered that. But just if I can, in terms of the sort of the psychological aspect, before we come back to that one, I think that was interesting. Obviously. The bringing in ACT there, and obviously again the Freudian ideas. What had struck me about Jekyll's professed mission and here is that it sounded a bit like the kind of, as we discussed in an earlier episode, the Karen Horney's kind of neurotic quest for glory idea, because to me it seemed a bit like what Jekyll was seen as. He kind of states that he both has, he's this dual being, and that there's the good part and the evil part, and he's kind of both invested in both. But it's a bit like the good part is almost a bit like the sort of ego ideal, the kind of what he thinks his public self should ideally be, and it's almost a bit like he's aware he has these urges to vice that don't fit with that, and he's decided they're just like a separate self within himself. It's like he's done a kind of split, and he's, there's a kind of, in a way, almost neurotic. And I think you're right about he wants to advance his scientific career, and there's the curiosity definitely driving it, which you could say is a little bit more authentic. But there definitely does seem, I think you initially said this kind of purity, this sense that he must be absolutely all of one, and then he can also be absolutely all of the opposite. There's definitely a sense of somebody trying to almost make themselves their idealized self in a way that is clearly impossible and going to be very, very destructive and divisive, actually. And we have to admit that if we construe our ordinary humanity as fallen, then there could be that temptation, from a religious point of view. Yeah, absolutely.
This idea of trying to then rise up again from that fall into some, as you say, ego ideal kind of state.
Yeah.
I mean, he has this view, as he describes in his statement, of what happened, that, he could separate out the good and the evil, and the good could then, move up to the heavens, so to speak, unhindered, really there. But it is a bit Faustian in that he's wanting to exceed the limits of the human there, to sort of become more than human.
Well, indeed. I mean, it's I mean, if it is a kind, I mean, I know this wouldn't be the way that Stevenson would have thought about it, but if it is a kind of neurotic fantasy, obviously with, you know, the kind of almost magical aspect that he can create this through his potions, you know, really anybody doing that wouldn't actually be undergoing moral or emotional growth, but obviously intellectually, you know, he's making these groundbreaking discoveries, and he can, you know, in the ego and the kind of public acclaim, you know, that he can also achieve by being this best public version of himself. You know, they're a kind of pseudo growth, a kind of superiority from a social point of view, but not really any kind of true growth there. Actually, you know, obviously it's all kind of, you know, neurotic in its substance there. And
yes, I mean it is. It's and I think obviously that neurotic viewpoint is sort of supported by this view of good and evil, because you know, in the novel and probably in the society at large at the time, morality is kind of seen as more in terms of inhibition, you know, restraint, or you know, you know how Freud depicted the superego as mainly saying no to desires, like this sort of inner check on our desires, which is actually quite a narrow view of what morality is, because you know, if we go back many centuries before, people like Aristotle saw ethics as being connected with human flourishing. Yeah. So, you know, in other words, the moral life wasn't something that was simply saying no to your desires. It wasn't just the source of frustration. It was also something that allowed you to grow and develop and flourish. Yeah. But you have no sense of that in this novel. So if we saw good as sort of something that restrains the bad, you can see then that why you'd want to just try and cut off this bad, you know, siphon it off, really.
I think you're spot on. I mean, it's like Jekyll's mindset, you know, the way he understands good. He's not reflected on it. It's not derived from any own personal principles. It's just almost entirely socially imbibed, and it's about looking good. Good is what will make you look good amongst your peers. That's good. And anything, as you say, that makes you look bad is evil and must be restrained. And it's a very crude, actually, way of thinking about morality, you know, and the idea that you somehow want to divide yourself along those lines, it would be a terribly harmful.
Well, it is. I mean, well, one of the Victorian things about this novel is that when the narrator refers to pleasure, it's seen as something that is, you know, undignified, something that is suspect.
Yep.
Because the animal carnal part of ourselves is seen as bad, is seen as regressive, and yet it's such an inherent part of who we are in terms of our embodiment that, you know, it's like you can't really escape from it unless, of course, you find some way to siphon that off, and which is what Hyde is, you know, this animal. Almost animal part of ourselves, and it's almost like the angelic part of us can soar up to the heavens, as Jekyll thought it would. I mean, I think that.
Sorry, yeah.
I mean, you know how we spoke about this being a horror story, in that the evil is not simply external; it is also within.
Yeah.
But I think that the horror of this story extends even deeper than that, because if you look at how Hyde evolved, so to speak, over the course of the novel, you know, Jekyll talks first of all about the sense of freedom that he felt as Hyde, the lack of restraint, and how much Hyde loves life, which I think is a very telling comment. But as time goes on, after he has had that incident with the child, and then he has killed Sir Danvers Carew, Hyde actually starts to worry about his own safety. I mean, you know, this novel is almost like propaganda for capital punishment, because Jekyll says it was Hyde's fear of the gallows that scared him more than anything else. So what it's showing actually is that as Hyde evolves as a person, he starts to think more prudentially, he starts to think about his own safety. And, Hyde taking some precautions, Hyde weeping in front of the fireside about what's going to come of him. He's starting to become more like Jekyll. And I think this is one of the unsettling things of the novel, is that, Jekyll thought that his ornery self and, Hyde would be quite separate. But I think what the novel actually suggests is that Hyde was not becoming quite Jekyll, but there wasn't so much a gap between Jekyll and Hyde as what Jekyll would have wanted, and indeed what the readers would have wanted.
That's a very interesting point. I guess it suggests as well that in a way that the overarching, kind of irrepressible power of the society, actually, in terms of, it will catch up with a Hyde. If he violates its norms, then even he, this kind of, as you say, apish free spirit, comes to cower before it. It's that much bigger than him. And
well, yes, yeah. I mean, the thing is, in reality, while Hyde is apish in some ways, or seen as degenerate in that Victorian way, you could also see that his Soho flat is decorated quite in a cultured way. This is something that Utterson notices.
Yeah.
When him and the policeman are ransacking, looking at the ransacked flat, is that actually it was decorated with some taste, which reflects Jekyll's taste. When Hyde asks Lanyon, would he prefer if he took the potion away or take it in front of him, and he warns him that it will change his whole worldview. Lanyon wishes to see him take the potion, and Hyde gives a very short speech about how people like him have lacked intellectual imagination.
Yeah. Yep.
So actually, this character is more civilized in some ways. He's more a composite than what he might initially seem. And he grows almost into a pseudo-Jekyll nearer the end, because he does become quite worrisome about his future, really. He's not identical with Jekyll, but I think that it is suggesting, as I've said earlier, that morality is mainly fueled by fear, by a sense of prudence.
Definitely. And I think sorry, I mean, it's like, as we discussed at the start, but by the logic of Jekyll's view of good and evil, then Utterson would be the pinnacle of goodness. But obviously he is being critiqued here as a very sad, lifeless figure, actually. So it's definitely all of this is being, critiqued in a sense, and it leaves the reader quite unsettled, because there's not really any clear-cut answer here. It's just a lot of horror, actually, in terms of this view of good and evil.
Well, it is, and I mean, the way that Jekyll explains why Hyde kills Sir Danvers Carew, because it seems almost motiveless.
Yeah.
I mean, in some ways, it is sort of a bit strange, that murder, because Sir Danvers Carew stops Hyde to ask him. Maybe it's something like directions, but he wishes to be informed about something by Hyde, and Hyde actually stops.
Yeah.
So if he was the very embodiment of impatience and animal-like, I can't really imagine that he would have stopped. There's a degree of decorum there that's a little bit ironic. But anyway, Jekyll explains Hyde's attack as that he had been caged for so long that it was almost like this tiger being released from the cage, and there was this great desire and impatience to go out and satisfy his pleasures, and that's why he attacked Danvers Carew. Now, it's not a very sophisticated or compelling psychological explanation as to why Hyde did what he did. But the reason I'm raising it just now is that there is, in that explanation, basically a worldview regarding good and evil, which is that actually evil has a primacy. It is primal. It is primary. Okay. And it's locked up in this cage of morality. Yeah. That's all morality is, really, is a cage. Yeah. And then if that cage breaks, then out comes romping Hyde. And so it's not actually a very flattering depiction of what goodness is or what morality is. It actually gives evil, if we want to use that term, much more a primacy. It's much more fundamental than good.
I think that's a very fair point. And it is interesting that as you described, really quite peculiar murder scene whereby it's ultimately his motive is just sheer impatience at somebody stopping him and talking for too long to the point he seems to lose it in this. It's a very peculiarly motivated murder, but then of course once he lashes out, he can't stop himself. He keeps hitting him until he's killed him. But yeah, very, very strange. And as you said, just a sense of evil just in there. That's just, once it's out in the kind of slightly vulnerable good cage that's trying to keep it in place, that just can't really quite contain it.
Yes,
it's I mean,
and I mean, if we look at the melodramatic depiction of or description of Sir Danvers Carew, I mean, he's obviously this MP, this upper class gentleman, and he's portrayed as quite angelic, almost, as so that echelon of the society, the people that would be adhering, at least ostensibly, to the good life, to respectability. He's portrayed as the very embodiment of kindness. There, I think it was important for the novel that he did murder Sir Danvers Carew, because Danvers Carew as this eminent gentleman meant that it would become so public what Hyde had done. Sure. Whereas, as we've seen in, say, the Yorkshire Ripper cases, that when he was initially killing prostitutes at the time, there wasn't really much of a headway in the investigation because these people very sadly weren't deemed important enough. Very tragic. So yes, if Hyde had been killing some prostitutes in the novel, I don't think it would have created that public scandal that killing Danvers Carew did.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, obviously, it's such that Hyde is permanently on the run, from that point onwards. The idea that everybody's out looking for him because he's killed somebody eminent. So no, I think that's true. I think you're right. It does highlight that. Yeah, again, the idea that the evil of a murder is considered more evil the more eminent, supposedly, the individual, the victim. Yeah, I think that's true. Obviously, Jekyll, in his letter, his reflections on this disaster that he's led himself into is to come to the conclusion that as human beings, we simply have to live with this irreconcilable dual nature as he saw it. Now, we don't obviously have to agree with that prognosis, but this sense that we're simply condemned to live with that. And that's probably about as much as is put forward as an answer, to this predicament. I mean, obviously there's the Utterson solution, which is the kind of, the repressive solution and the conformity and so on, but not very satisfying. So how much do you think there's a kind of Victorian kind of worldview really skewing this take on the human predicament here? Is this the case? Is that the right way to formulate it? That we live with good and evil urges in us, and we're just kind of somewhat split in that sense, or do you think that's
I think if you defined the bad or the evil in part as connected with embodiment with the body, with the animal side, then you could see why you'd be condemned to always having that conflict, because we have a body and we have an animal nature. But I don't I think there's a real problem with this idea of parts, partitioning the good and the evil. I mean, I'm thinking about the well-known psychoanalyst Melanie Klein, and she talks about two positions that a person could have from an emotional point of view towards the world: the paranoid schizoid position and the depressive position. The depressive position being more a sign of maturity, but the paranoid schizoid position is where we split people into good and bad. It may be that there's good people, the group that we identify with, and then there's the baddies, our opponents who are totally evil. Or it may be that we split a person into the good and the bad, and we want to relate to the so-called good while overlooking the bad. That could be a way of idealizing someone. It could also be a way of moving between idealizing and denigrating them, moving back and forth pendulum wise. So I think whereas the depressive position is recognizing that person has good and bad traits, that they're a mixture of qualities, that it is complex, and that you can't simply idealize them, and you can't simply condemn them either. But you're forced to a more complicated emotional response. And as she's sort of intimating, it's difficult for human beings to inhabit that space of complexity and nuance. We are rather fond of splitting things and seeing others and ourselves in this dichotomous kind of light. Really there. So, but I think the thing about seeing the good and the evil as different parts, or just as separate, is that not only is that not true, I don't think we just have a good part and a bad part and they're separated by some sort of psychological partition. I don't think that's how we are. We're a blend of qualities rather than this sort of stark parts. But I think primary problem from my point of view of seeing ourselves as having good parts and bad parts is that it sort of condemns the bad part to being abandoned. That becomes then the destiny of that part, because it's like we can't do anything about that. So we may not try and educate or cultivate it. It almost becomes separated from our reason. Really, it's like we can make no rational appeal to that part. Which I don't think is the case, because obviously there's aspects of our nature that we don't like, but it may vary at each stage of our life. I mean, these parts could grow and evolve too. They are still subject to learning. They're still subject to reason. Whereas if we kind of just see them as a separate part that there's nothing we can do with, that we could change in them, then they become like. We become like a parent that sees a child as being hopeless, that we can't really help them to change. We just abandon that part.
I think that's spot on. I mean, it's such a kind of bleak perspective, really, and it's like the kind of bleakness that pervades the novel. The sense that the evil is just repressed and put down and killed off, or the parts of the self. That's all that can be really done with them. In that very kind of fatalistic way, which I suppose in a way is a little bit like the kind of, I guess, the Freudian view about the superego, that really, you have neurosis when it's too strong or too lax, and there's an appropriate level of kind of superego control of our instincts and so on. But that view, I mean, obviously over time we've had more of the kind of, the kind of humanistic psychology movement, whereby I think, as you suggested, people, there might be a slightly more nuanced view of the different parts of ourselves, that, and certainly a sense that they aren't something fixed, actually, that there can be change there, and integration to some extent. So, and also, of course, as you mentioned earlier, the idea that when we bring them into consciousness rather than burying them in the unconscious, at least then, even if we don't want to act on them at all times, they're still us. We're still kind of holding them within our self in a way that makes them actually have less power over us. In a way they're not the shadow side so much. They're just a part of ourselves that we can either work with or whatever it may be. So,
yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's the case. I mean, if we see it from a Carl Rogers point of view, Carl Rogers, said that we all have these murderous wishes or these desires that aren't always pro-social in their orientation. But his view was that if you overall accepted yourself with what he called unconditional positive regard, then your choices would be much more towards the pro-social, towards doing the right thing. In his view, if you didn't accept these parts of yourself, then they would be repressed. They would slip into unconsciousness. There would be then this, start inner conflict between the self-concept, what you thought you consciously were, and what you were overall. There. So both Carl Rogers and Freud are talking about integration, which means inviting these parts into awareness, try to see if they can be used constructively, or have they to be accepted and that you act in spite of them,
and in both cases,
rather than suppressing them.
Sorry, exactly. And I think the Melanie Klein description there was absolutely spot on, because the depressive position, which obviously sounds like a kind of, I think that maybe slightly unfortunately termed there, because what we're really talking about is a more adult, in touch with reality point, which is as you say, you're not idealizing, you're accepting a little bit of parts of yourself that are maybe a bit difficult to work with, and they have to sort of be tolerated. And it's a much more nuanced take on everything, rather than just this more let's wish it away, kind of more infantile, paranoid, schizoid way of being or sort of perceiving yourself in that sense. You're ideal, or you're the worst possible evil. You're not some kind of complicated mixture in a way.
Well, yes, yeah. I mean, I think she probably called it the depressive position because there is a loss there, at least initially. And there is this sort of assumption in psychoanalysis that reality is, at least initially, a bit downbeat compared to having our wishes satisfied. Sure. But again, it's a bit like what Anna Freud said, that dreams are satisfying but not fulfilling. And so to have fulfillment, you've got to engage with reality. And so if we're idealizing people and denigrating others, not only is that a recipe for violence, but it's also a recipe for being satisfied in a delusional way, but not really being fulfilled.
Absolutely,
there. And I think also another thing that's worth considering in terms of the dangers of seeing ourselves as good and evil, this dichotomy, is that, it doesn't look at the sufficient complexities, which is that, what we might term as good could be in some context bad, and vice versa.
Sure.
So, I mean, if we see it in a kind of Jekyll-like way, the part of us that could, be murderously aggressive. I mean, psychoanalysts say that we all have murderous wishes, and Theodore Reich had actually said, a murderous wish a day keeps the analyst away. But and I mean, you might think, well, what are they talking about? But then, if you look at how popular serial killer documentaries or slasher movies are, there's obviously part of the psyche that can resonate with that, as unpleasant as it is. Now, if we see it in a Jekyll-like way, we're going to just see that as, that is part of our evil side.
Yeah.
But, a Jungian or a Gestalt therapist could look at it in a different way. And what they could look at is that, say, if you had a dream, and you know, people do have these dreams, these nightmares from time to time, you know, where they're being stalked by a Michael Myers kind of figure.
Yeah.
And, you know, the Gestalt therapist, if they were working with that dream, would ask the person to identify with that figure and to articulate what they were thinking or feeling, because it would be getting in touch with this aggressive side of their nature. But that aggressive side could have quite a lot of energy. And so integrating it into the self could actually help you to be more motivated, actually to have a kind of more aggressive forward take on your projects, on your ambitions. So, you know, just to call it categorically evil might be downplaying in some ways in which it could serve a constructive purpose.
I think that's a great point. I mean, it just seems so striking in this novel, as we discussed, that, you know, the vitality and the energy and spontaneity of Hyde is just seen as evil. It just seems such a kind of strange way to label those parts when, as you say, there's all kinds of context, and including the aggressive parts where they're actually extremely helpful and could be pro-social, constructive parts, actually. You know, it's that
I mean, there's almost that Nietzschean point in the book, isn't it, that when Jekyll concedes that, you know, how much Hyde loved life, it's then this idea, well, how much does Utterson love life?
Well, exactly.
And so is it this Nietzschean point that morality is anti-life, or some moral systems are anti-life? There, you know, I think that's raised in this novel too.
I think that's it. I mean, it's interesting in a way to get into these kind of considerations with this novella, because it does seem a little bit to me like that it is posing a lot of ethical questions that you really do need to think deeply about to come up with an answer to. And obviously they were maybe the questions that Stevenson did have of his society, actually. And I think that's, I don't know how much he thought of it in those terms, but I think, these issues of integration, you know, really are key, and that's what was being missed in that world, really. I guess I think maybe we're probably just about out of time for this one.
Yes, I mean,
thanks so much.
We haven't given a full statement of the case, but
we haven't indeed.
We might, which is not possible when we're talking about the moral being of humankind. But let's hope that we've helped people to, you know, reflect a bit more on this, you know, iconic novel.
I mean, such a short novel, but such a kind of rich one when it comes to these kind of
themes. And one final thing I would say about it is that if anyone wants to engage with a film adaptation of this novel, that in my opinion the best one to watch is the 1931 pre-Hays Code version with Frederick March. He won an Oscar, a much-deserved Oscar, for playing Jekyll and Hyde. He plays both parts very convincingly, very memorably. Sadly, it was a low point in Spencer Tracy's career, playing Jekyll and Hyde 10 years later. It had great production values and great stars in it, but somehow Tracy could not pull it off.
Yes. No, it's true. I mean, March, he's a little bit forgotten now. He's not, you know, compared to Tracy in terms of how many people would recognise the name, but he was an incredible talent, and I think you're right. That was for such a, you know, a movie from 1931. It is an incredibly good adaptation of this story. It certainly
is, and it also highlights this idea of Hyde being both animal and bourgeois sadist, that March is able to play both parts of Hyde's nature very well in that movie.
Yeah. Excellent.
So that's just a recommendation to our viewers anyway.
Fantastic. Yeah, well, thank you. Thanks for that,
Okay,
Alex.
thank you for that as well.
Yeah, cheers. Good night.